So this is our classroom for the semester. I know, not as great as the other ones, but it's what we got. So hopefully this will work without any issues, hopefully. So we're going to start talking about the Constitution today, or constitutions in the state of Texas, because there's been quite a few of them. So we'll talk a little bit about the previous constitutions, and then we'll end with a little bit of a discussion about the constitutional amendments that were voted on last November 2019. Okay. And as we go along, no, I gotta pull up the lecture. Oh. Hello, come on in. I love the slowness of technology sometimes. Can you all see the screen? Okay, just wanted to make sure. Okay. Like I said, this is the first half of chapter 2. We're going to talk a bit today about how state constitutions are created, issues like checks and balances, and then, of course, the creation of our state constitutions. Okay, so if you need something repeated or you have a question as we go along, just let me know. All right, so if you've taken federal government, this will be familiar. If not, federalism basically is divided. Most of the power does go to the federal government, but some of it does go to the states. And this is because of the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says any powers not specifically given to the federal government are reserved for the states. So if the power is not directly given to the federal government, then the states have the right to set the policy. And over time, as the country's grown, as the government has grown, we've seen the federal government giving power to the states, handing over control of things like education, healthcare, interstates, things like that. So it's called cooperative federalism. And the metaphor that gets used to describe this is called the cake metaphor. So federalism originally was kind of like a layer cake. The state government was vanilla and the federal government was chocolate. And if you sliced into it, you got both layers. But now it's more like a marble cake. The chocolate and the vanilla are swirled together. So you see more of an intermingling, more cooperation between the federal and the state governments. There's also what's known as the picket fence metaphor. It's not really a cake anymore so much as it's separate spikes along the fence. You've got the federal government, you've got the state government, you've got various parts of the bureaucracy, interest groups, and so on. So for example, hurricane relief, right? After Hurricane Laura came through, you had the federal government, you have both Texas and Louisiana state governments, FEMA, the Red Cross, the Humane Society, and others all get involved in the cleanup and recovery of that area. So it's not just state and federal government anymore. It's also various parts of the government, interest groups. So it's a lot of commingling of actors at various levels trying to figure out policy, trying to deal with the aftermath of a hurricane or a major tornado or a disaster like 9/11. Okay, any questions before we move on? Is anyone impacted by Hurricane Hannah? Anyone have home damage or anything like that? No? Another example of the cooperative relationship between the federal and the state governments is healthcare. So, of course, you've got the private insurance companies, but then you also have federal healthcare in terms of Medicare, Medicaid, and the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. So, the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010 with the idea that it would reduce the healthcare costs and some of the burden on the states. Federal law requires every hospital to treat a patient even if they don't have insurance or if they don't have money. They can't ask you for your insurance if you're being rushed in after a car accident, for example. They still have to treat you. But what happens more often than not is if the patient doesn't have the ability to pay, unless they can take them to court, the hospital has to basically deal with the cost of paying for that person's care. Of course, it's very expensive on the hospitals. So the idea was to lower the number of uninsured people, to give them at least emergency room coverage so they're not stuck with a ridiculously high bill and the hospitals can get some money. Also, of course, to give people the ability to afford to see a doctor. Removing the provision that you could charge more for a pre-existing condition. For example, before the Affordable Care Act, you could be charged more if you were a diabetic, if you had a pre-existing heart condition, if you were a cancer survivor. My personal favorite, women getting charged more for health insurance because pregnancy is a pre-existing condition in women. No. So the idea was, let's lower the cost of healthcare. And in 2012, the Supreme Court said it is constitutional. Congress has the right to pass what essentially was a tax or a tax break. So states had to accept the Affordable Care Act. Texas had to buy into the healthcare exchange. That's why if you go to healthcare.gov and put in your information, they'll tell you how much you would have to pay, right? So every state is required to comply with the Affordable Care Act. Where they were not required to comply was with the extension of Medicaid. Congress wanted more Medicaid coverage across the states to again lower the burden of healthcare costs. And the federal government said to Texas, if you spend about 10% of the cost on Medicaid extension, we'll pay for the other 90%. So if you spend $1.3 billion, we'll give you $12 billion. Sounds like a pretty good bargain, right? But the state rejected it for two reasons. One, $1.3 billion, not exactly small change. And two, what happens if we spend that $1.3 billion and then Congress comes back and says, we can't actually give you $12 billion, you're going to have to pay for it yourself. So Texas said, thank you very much, but we're not actually going to accept this offer. So Texas rejected the Medicaid expansion. So we do still have a fairly large number of uninsured Texans because of this rejection of the expansion. And by and large, we do tend to value independence from regulations rather than government assistance. We don't want the government telling us where to spend our money, how to spend our money. So if the money comes with strings attached, the attitude of the Texas government is thank you, but no thank you. We'll figure it out on our own. Out of curiosity, do any of you have your health insurance through the Affordable Care Act? No? Okay. Just let me step away for a second just to see if there's any questions on collaborate. No. Okay. Just checking. Okay. All right. Any questions before we move on? Everyone good? Okay. So why do we have a federal and a state constitution? What's the point, right? Why do we need multiple constitutions? Well, the first thing is it does provide legitimacy to every level of government, local, state, and national. It says what the government is allowed to do and what the government is not allowed to do, right? They're not allowed to search our home without our permission or a warrant. They're not allowed to execute you for shoplifting. They're not allowed to hold you in jail indefinitely without a trial. So it gives the government legitimacy with the citizens. It gives us the chance to know what the government's allowed to do and what it's not allowed to do, what our rights are, how the government should be working. And it's also true that the government has to be able to act in ways that we can't, right? We can't go 90 miles an hour down Business 83 and run every red light, but a cop car can, right? If you've got emergency services, police officers, firefighters, ambulances can disobey speed limits, stop signs, red lights, because of course they're acting in a way that we can't, right? They're going to help someone out. So they have the right to act in ways that we can't, to take on tasks that we wouldn't be able to handle on our own. We also get the right to participate in decision making. Here in Texas, when the state legislature proposes amendments to the Constitution, we get to vote on them. We get a say in what gets added to our Constitution and what doesn't. So it gives us the ability to say, yes, we want this law, no, we don't want this law. It gives us some participation in the process. And also, constitutions give us a check on local government as well. If an off-duty police officer is running all the red lights, he's probably going to get into some trouble, right? Because he's not on duty, it's not his job at that point. And we do see a lot of different state regulations resulting from various state constitutions, state needs. For example, if you're a pedestrian in Los Angeles and you have the right of way, if a car doesn't stop, they can get a ticket for that. They are supposed to stop until every pedestrian has crossed the street. When I lived in Florida, it was more of a suggestion, and I can't count the number of times I almost got run over going across the street because apparently pedestrians are like, I don't know, in Florida, but not protected. Also, different things like speed limits, right? We have a higher speed limit on the interstate here in Texas compared to other states. We kind of feel like speed limits are a bit of a suggestion compared to other states. Things like a gas tax or laws on marijuana. Medical marijuana is legal in states like Florida, Michigan. Recreational marijuana is legal in California, Massachusetts, Colorado, Washington, but we don't have laws like that here in Texas yet. The state legislature has been debating legalizing medical marijuana. Whether or not they'll take it up in the next session, who knows? But for now, obviously that's the difference between us and, say, Florida. I think here they're pretty decent towards pedestrians. I haven't been run over yet when I'm out walking, so I'll take that as a good sign. And the lectures are online in case you miss anything or if you have to miss a class. I'll try to put them up before a class, but if I forget, they'll be up no later than the end of the day. Okay, so state governments do tend to be organized somewhat along the same lines as oh, okay, hang on, sorry, there's a problem with copyright. Let me just check. Okay. Sounds muffled. Okay. Let me try something else really quick. Sorry guys, this is one of those, this is going to be fun for a while kind of things. Okay. We'll get this figured out. It's just, it's going to take faculty a little while to figure out what we're doing. Hopefully this will work. Okay. This one is here, yes? Okay. Okay. All right. Let's try this. Hopefully it'll work a little bit better for um, everyone. Okay. Um, yes. Okay. So, like I was saying, state government is pretty well organized the same way as federal. Just makes it easier to adopt the existing system rather than reinvent the wheel. So, states do have a separate executive, judicial, and legislative set of branches. So here in Texas, the state executive branch is the governor. The judicial branch includes all of the state courts, and of course our state House and state Senate. We've also adopted the system of checks and balances, of allowing each part of the government to oversee the other. The governor can be impeached. State executives can be impeached. The governor can veto a legislative resolution, and so on. So our system is very, very similar to the federal system. Again, it's just easier than trying to reinvent the wheel. And every state except Nebraska has a bicameral legislature, meaning two chambers. So Nebraska only has one. It's a combined House and Senate. They're the only state to do it that way. I have no idea why. That's just the way they chose to do it. Every other state has a separate state House and a state Senate. And of course, the constitutional process, the constitutional drafting is going to vary by state. In some states, voters can propose a constitutional amendment. We cannot. Only the state legislature can propose a constitutional amendment in Texas. We as citizens are not allowed to do so. In other states like um, Florida, for example, if you get enough signatures of registered voters, it gets on the ballot. Here, it can only come from the state legislature. So it's going to vary by state. It's going to depend on where you're living. When I lived in Florida, I was part of the process to get two amendments on the state constitution. The first to legalize medical marijuana. It failed the first time, got on the ballot the second time, and then an amendment to allow felons who are out of jail to get their voting rights back. That actually did pass. There's conditions on it, but they get the right to vote back in Florida if they meet those conditions. Here, all we can do is just vote when the legislature puts forward constitutional amendments. Okay. So in terms of some of the powers that we see in the Constitution, overall, the federal government does have implied power over citizens and states through what's called the necessary and proper clause. Essentially, what it says is Congress shall take all measures considered necessary and proper for the running of the country. So, of course, federal law will supersede state law. If Texas tried to pass a law saying we're going to give the death penalty to all convicted felons, well, that's a violation of the Eighth Amendment and Supreme Court rulings, so of course that law would be overturned. So if Texas law contradicts federal law, usually the federal law will override the state law. Now there are some areas where we do share power with the federal government. Healthcare, of course, but also something like a gasoline tax. There is a federal gas tax that's 18 cents a gallon. But states also have the right to pass their own gas tax as well. So you'll pay the federal gas tax, and you might also pay a state gas tax. In California, for example, the state gas tax is 12 cents a gallon, so they pay 30 cents a gallon in taxes. That 12 cents a gallon in California was done to help improve the roads and try to create mass transit in cities like Los Angeles, where it's desperately needed. So you'll pay the federal gas tax, and you'll pay a small share to the state of Texas as well. And we do benefit from relatively cheaper gas prices because of the oil here in Texas. We pay a bit less compared to states like California, where it's gone as high as $4 a gallon. States do get to control local law and local law enforcement. The state gets to decide how many different law enforcement agencies there are. If one community gets law enforcement, or if it's shared between smaller communities. We do, of course, also have Border Patrol here in Texas, right? We have more law enforcement because of the fact that we're a border state. You're not going to see Border Patrol necessarily in Illinois, but of course you have to have them here in Texas. So the state also gets to control how many types of local government there are, what cities get to run themselves and which don't. And the state's also in charge of intra-state commerce. So within the state of Texas, the government gets to decide what the rules are for transporting food across Texas roads, right? If you're an ATV truck driver, you're subject to the laws of Texas if you're in the state. So you've got to obey state speed limits, or having your load weighed before you go back out on the road, things like that. So if it's intra-state, it's up to the Texas government to decide what the rules are. Once you cross the state line, it's interstate instead. And we do incorporate the Bill of Rights into every state constitution. If you look at our state constitution, which is very long, by the way, but if you look at it, all of the Bill of Rights have been incorporated in some form or another. Also, every time there is a federal constitutional amendment added, we have to add it to the Texas state constitution. So when the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18, that had to get added to Texas state law. So we do incorporate all of the elements of the federal constitution in some form or another into the state constitution. Also, if there's a change to federal law, it can invalidate a state constitutional amendment. For example, in Texas, it used to be that under the law, marriage was only recognized as being between one man and one woman. But in 2015, when the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage on the national level, that amendment became invalid. Can't be enforced, can't be put into place. So federal law will sometimes invalidate our state's actions. Any questions? Okay, any questions for those of you online? So again, there are limits on what we can do as a state. Federal law does supersede state law. So when the federal government passes a law saying same-sex marriage is valid across the United States, Texas cannot deny same-sex couples the right to get married. We can't decide not to buy into the Affordable Care Act. We have to. So if Congress passes a law or the Supreme Court makes a ruling, it will supersede state law. Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 overturned state segregation laws in schools. So Texas had to comply and desegregate schools in 1954. So again, federal law does supersede state law. So we are bound to the laws of the federal government. We can't just decide to do whatever we want. There are also limits on what the governor is allowed to do. And I'll talk more about those limits when we get to the chapter on the governor. But broadly speaking, he or she doesn't have the ability to remove whomever they want from office. Because so many of our state offices are elected and not appointed, the governor can't really remove someone without really good cause. So he's limited, Governor Abbott's limited in that sense. And of course, we're also protected by the Bill of Rights. We have the right to a trial by jury if we ask for one, the right to a lawyer, the right to deny a police officer the right to search our car without probable cause. Basically, all of the protections outlined in the Bill of Rights are given to us. So if Texas violates those rights, we can file a complaint against the state of Texas. And there have been Supreme Court cases about states violating people's constitutional rights. There was a case in Louisiana, for example, where a man was arrested and he wasn't put on trial for 8 years. Obviously, that's a violation of the Bill of Rights. And our Constitution, by and large, is a reaction to the post-Civil War era, where we didn't really have any control over what happened in our state. Because we were on the losing side of the war, we basically got told, here's what you have to do. So our state government is severely limited because of the abuse of power that happened post-Civil War when the state didn't really get to control the government. Okay. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, our state constitution it has changed significantly over time. This is our sixth state constitution. And a lot of that, of course, is tied to the history of Texas overall. So the most recent constitution was ratified in 1876. We have not rewritten the state constitution. We simply amended it some 400 times. So our first constitution that was created when we became an independent nation ended up resembling the national constitution in many, many ways. It was just, again, it's easier to model a state constitution after the federal one rather than try to completely come up with your own idea. So it was a lot easier to simply adopt the national constitution, but add our own elements. We did have a president of Texas. We did have a Congress. But the Constitution also said slavery will be legal in Texas. So it varied a little bit from the national Constitution, but it did contain a lot of the elements of the federal Constitution. And because we were a slave-owning nation, some of the states in the north didn't necessarily want Texas to become a state because they didn't want another slave state being added. But nonetheless, we did become a state in 1845. So of course you have to change the Constitution at that point, right? You can't have a president anymore. You have to change the name of the legislature. So we modeled our state constitution after states like Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, because they were all slave-owning states. And that constitution in 1845 was based on the principles of Andrew Jackson. So they included things like participation for white men, almost every office up for the popular vote, short terms for state offices, and patronage, right? If you were the niece or nephew of someone in the governor's office, well, you're guaranteed a state job at that point. So it was very similar in a lot of ways to the constitutions across the South. And then when we left the United States during the Civil War, there was greater protection put into place for slavery, and instead of declaring allegiance to the United States, we declared allegiance to the Confederacy. Okay, so after the Civil War, of course, we couldn't keep an outdated constitution that declared allegiance to a body that no longer existed. So President Johnson ordered Texas and every state that was part of the Confederacy to rewrite their state constitution. Slavery obviously had to be made illegal. They had to make secession from the United States illegal, and they had to renounce all the debts they owed to the Confederacy at a minimum. So at a minimum in this Constitution, we had to outlaw slavery, make secession from the U.S. illegal, and say we're not paying any war debts we owe to other states that were part of the Confederacy. So Texas only made the changes that were considered necessary to rejoin the U.S. He said, fine, we'll put that into the Constitution, let us back in. And while that was good enough to get us back into the United States, Congress said, that's not good enough. You're going to have to fix it. So we had to rewrite the Constitution again. And this was known as the Radical Reconstruction Constitution. So the Reconstruction era was at the end of the Civil War, when the North essentially dominated the South. So basically what happened was African Americans were allowed to vote, but white Texans largely were not, because if you had participated in the Civil War, you couldn't vote on this Constitution. So the Radical Reconstruction Constitution allowed African Americans to vote and to serve in office, centralized power, created an annual legislative session, and said you have to pay your state officials. But because this was passed without the participation of most Texans, because most of the white men couldn't vote, it was never really accepted by the majority of Texans. A lot of white Texans said, look, we didn't have a say in this Constitution, we don't recognize it as valid. So for a brief period of time, African Americans were allowed to participate in politics across the South. And there were actually African American men elected to Congress in southern states. But after that era ended, of course, they lost the right to vote again. But for a brief period of time, minorities in Texas could vote and hold state office. But what showed that the Constitution had to be reformed yet again was the fact that, first of all, most of the Texans didn't get to participate in it, so that's not a good sign for a Constitution. And second, that the governor was essentially a dictator. He had a tremendous amount of power. He had the ability to essentially do whatever he wanted. He could override the state legislature, he could issue orders, and so it became clear pretty quickly that this was not going to work. You can't have a governor acting as a dictator. You can't have him telling everyone what they're allowed to do or not. So this is when we had to rewrite the Constitution yet again. So in the space of roughly 20-something years, we rewrote the Constitution 6 times. So it was a very, very turbulent time for Texas. A lot of changes, a lot of constitutions, but eventually we mostly figured it out. Okay, any questions? No? Any questions online? Okay. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pull up the article I found State constitution, as we changed it last year. Did any of you vote in the constitutional amendment election last year? No? Okay. Yeah, it was an odd election because the state legislature only meets in odd years, and we're used to elections being an even number of years, so people sometimes forget there's an election after the state legislature meets. But nonetheless, there were 10 proposed amendments to vote on. The first one, and the only one to be rejected, was the first one, which would have allowed municipal court judges to serve multiple municipalities at the same time. So essentially, what this would have is said that if you've got small jurisdictions and you've got one judge serving both, that would be fine. The voters said no to that. The voters said we prefer that they only serve one jurisdiction at a time. From a money viewpoint, it would have made sense to allow judges to serve more than one municipality, but then there are questions about legitimacy and things like that, so the voters said no to that. Proposition 2 allows the water board to basically fund water projects in very low income areas across the state. So areas like the Rio Grande Valley would have the ability to apply for a bond to help with issues like water quality, drainage, and so on. That one passed, I think, partly because of the flooding the state's seen over the past couple of years, and the realization that our water system needs some improvements. I thought these passed very, very easily. Like Proposition 3, it doesn't take much for people to say that should be the law. Basically, what Proposition 3 said was the legislature can exempt people from having to pay property taxes if their property was damaged by a natural disaster. So if your home had been damaged by Hurricane Hannah, you would be able to apply for a property tax exemption to deal with the cleanup of your house. So that overwhelmingly passed. So if your house gets hit by a tornado or a hurricane or a flood, you can apply to get your property taxes exempted so you can get your house fixed up. Kind of a no-brainer, right? Can't really think of why you wouldn't be okay with that. Proposition 4, there is no state income tax in Texas. If there were to be one, originally it had to be a simple majority, basically 51%. So what this constitutional amendment does was said, if the state wants to create a state income tax at some point, now they need a 2/3 majority in the House, a 2/3 majority in the Senate, and a 2/3 majority vote by the people. They didn't make it impossible to create a state income tax, but they've made it much, much harder. So it's not impossible, it's just going to be very hard for the state to actually pass a state income tax in the future. Proposition 5, sporting sales good tax would go to, sporting goods sales tax would go to Texas Parks and Wildlife for upkeep of parks, places to go hunting, fishing, things like that. Again, pretty overwhelmingly in favor of that, right? We'd like to preserve the wildlife that we have here in Texas, protect our parks, beaches, and so on. Proposition 6, more money going to cancer prevention and research. Big problem. There is some cutting edge research being done here in Texas, so the idea was let's give more money so that they can do more biomedical research. Again, pretty overwhelmingly approved. Proposition 7, increasing the amount of money for schools in terms of classroom materials and so on. Obviously, that's a big one with teachers, right? If you know teachers in the public schools, you know a lot of the times they have to pay for classroom materials out of their own pocket. Hopefully this will help relieve some of that, right? Because teachers shouldn't have to pay for their classroom supplies. It's kind of obscene that they do. Proposition 8, creating a flood infrastructure fund. Here in Wessico, in 2019, at the beginning of the year, the voters did pass something like $100 million bond to improve the drainage system here. With that flooding in 2018, that was catastrophic. It became clear to the voters, we got to do something about this, right? We're a low-lying area. We got to do something about this. We can't keep having this happen. Proposition 9 would have created a property tax exemption for precious metals like coal and others. So basically, the state depositories of coal and other minerals would be exempt from property taxes. This was actually pretty close. It got approved, but pretty thin margin of approval on that one. And my personal favorite, and the one that was overwhelmingly passed, was Proposition 10. Basically, what used to happen is if an animal retired from law enforcement, like a bomb sniffing dog or something, they would either go to a new owner or unfortunately probably be put to sleep. So what this does is it says that if an animal is going to retire, their former handlers or someone who's qualified to take care of them can adopt them without a fee, minimizing the chance that they may be put to sleep. 94% approval. I have no idea why people would vote no on that, but this was pretty overwhelmingly like a no-brainer for most people, right? You've got to protect the animals as well. So our next legislative session will be January. How that's going to work with COVID, I don't know. I don't know if they'll have to do a virtual session. It may be a little bit more tricky. We'll have to see what amendments they come up with for this election, if there's anything relating to healthcare, disease control, anything like that. But if the legislature approves constitutional amendments again, we will go back and vote November of 2021 for these new constitutional amendments. Okay. Any questions on that? How many of you actually knew there was an election last November? November 2019, knew that there was an election? Not really? Yeah. It's supposed to be well advertised, but the reality is most people only pay attention to the big elections, president, governor, and so on. So when you're looking at this, you've got like probably not more than a couple million people in the state voting. So we're talking maybe 10–15% of the voters for a constitutional amendment if we're lucky. So that's about as good as it gets. Okay, any questions or comments on that? No? Okay. If you still don't have the textbook, that's fine. I know it takes a while to get it, so not a problem if you don't. Wednesday, we'll talk about the creation of the 1876 Constitution. You guys will be online, the other half will be here in person. We're not required to be online during class time. I know you might have other things you have to do. If you can be online, great. If you can't, the lectures are recorded. They'll be put up in YouTube. There's a link in the class to the the videos, as well as, okay. So there is a link here in Blackboard to the YouTube link, and then the lectures are here as well. So if you can't be online on Wednesday, don't worry about it. The lectures are recorded and you can watch them later. We will only be graded on attendance for the days you're in person, so only on Mondays. Then, are there any questions on that? No? Everyone's good? Okay. All right. If you do have any